I thank you all for being here, and I'm going to talk to you about the libraries in Pittsford. And I would love to be able to get inside your brain and transform you back to 1796. 1796 is when the town of Northfield was established. Actually, my book in my history office says 1797 when that was really officially done. But 1797, and just think, we're in 2000. Wow. And so try and think about what you wouldn't have in 1700. I mean, we think nothing about jumping in a car and getting here in 5 or 10 minutes. But when they had the first library organization meeting, it was at, and I ought to move my stuff forward, it started in 1803, and it lasted until 1809, but I can't tell you much about that. So let's go here. Here is the little house in which Major Ezra Patterson and his wife, they spelled her name S-I-L-E, but they called her Sheila. I'm not sure why, whether S-I-L-E was another country, you know, whatever. But they lived at 110 Mendon Center Road. Now I'll try and acclimate you as to where that is. There is an historic marker there, but it's almost at the playground for Mendon Center Elementary School. Now, are you with me? You know where we are? Yeah. Well, this little building, this little house, and I tell people that I am 150 years old, and I really almost am. But I remember this little house before they took it down. It was not looking as good as this, even. But Major Patterson, who was a major in the Revolutionary War, now think how long ago that was. Gee. And anyway, he built this little house, and he cleared the land around it and so forth, and he was elected supervisor of the town of Pittsford. And even being busy as a supervisor, he decided that there should be a library in the town of Northfield. Now, Northfield was the first name of what we know of today as Pittsford. There was Northfield, there was Smallwood, there was Boyle. Boy, I'm so glad they left that one out. And then in 1812, they went to Pittsford. And that was when this whole area, and it was Simon and Israel Stone who bought all this property, and then they divided it off into other towns. And in 1812, Brighton was taken off of Pittsford, or of Boyle, and what was left was called Pittsford. And Caleb Hopkins, who was also a hero of the war, the Revolutionary War, and also had been a supervisor, was given the honor of naming the town that was left, and he named it after his hometown of Pittsford, Vermont. So that's how we got to be Pittsford. Started out as Northfield, Smallwood, Boyle, and Pittsford. So here we are at this little house in Northfield, and in 1803, Sheila was reddening her house for company. And this was in February of 1803. Think what roads must have been. I mean, they were mostly trails. And the people who came, there was one, well, Stephen Lusk could just jump on a horse and come up from his house at the corner of Stone Road and Mendon Center. and just ride up to Major Patterson's house. And Noah Norton lived up on top of the hill on the other side of them on Mendon Center Road. Noah Norton had been a supervisor too. And so they could get there fairly easily. But a man named Oliver Culver came from Rochester. He had a very fast white horse, but it still took him 3 hours to get there. Now this was a February day, and I just think, isn't it amazing what they went through? So he came out from Rochester, and then, let's see, I want to make sure I get well, I know that Sheila was inside the house, getting the house ready. She had to find some sort of chairs for many. There were only 2 women who were going to be joining this group. And I'll tell you who they were as soon as I get to my list that tells me all the right people. But I told you about Stephen Lusk and Noah Norton. And then we had Amos and Simon Stone, and they could get there fairly easily on horseback and across the fields and so forth. But Mr. Billinghurst and George Peabody would have to hitch up the bobsled to the horses, probably have to have 2 horses, and come over ground. Now, Johnny Cake Street was what we know of as South Street. And the reason they called it Johnny Cake Street was because nothing would grow out that way except corn. They couldn't do wheat or anything else but corn, and then they could make Johnny Cake out of corn. So that's why it was called Johnny Cake Street. And they came, Mr. Billinghurst and George Parker and Desiree and Ann, and then Will Parker and Will Agate and Nathan Nye and Elihu Dowd. Now, Elihu Dowd lived kind of down there by Stephen Lusk. And Elihu Dowd was the brickmaker. Elihu Dowd made the bricks for almost every important building in this community. He made the bricks for the Phoenix building, if you know what I mean, and he made the bricks for the first schoolhouse. He was a busy, busy guy. Excuse me while I wipe my face. And Glover Perrin came, and there were 44 people who got inside that little bitty house. Now, probably Sheila and I had cider warming on an iron kettle on an arm in the fireplace. Excuse me. And hopefully she had some biscuits or something for them when they came. And maybe Nathan Nye would have brought something a little stronger because he had a distillery in his backyard. So that might have kept people warm. But they had gathered here to put together a lending library. And probably each one of those people brought a book, because where else would they get the book? And they probably had books that they were willing to share, and that was really very nice. But they had to set up some rules about the books that they had to share. So let's see. First of all, the meeting was called to order, and an objective was established, saying things like, "We, the subscribers, having entered into an association by the name of Northfield Library Company, for the purpose of establishing for our instruction, our enjoyment, our advantage, a library of such books as we shall think may most probably promote those ends. So other business such as management, dues, and rules all would be established at this meeting in 1803. And they decided they would meet once a year in February, and it was going to cost them some money. Each one of those subscribers had to pay $1. Now, when you think about the cost of a loaf of bread was maybe 3 cents, $1 was pretty dear, and they were all willing to put their dollars to use. I think that's pretty amazing. Then they decided to set the date for the annual meeting for each year, and it would be on the second Wednesday of February in each year. And the business of the company would be transacted. And you've been so patient, and I haven't even shown you the next slides that I have. And here's an historic marker. And I don't know, I hope that you've seen it. It's recently been repainted by an Eagle Scout. Well, he doesn't quite have his Eagle Scout yet, but he's passed everything. Ethan Rakoff painted all of the signs that were the historic markers, and they're all the same color. Not this blue and yellow, but they're kind of purple and gold, which is very nice and can be seen. And then that marker, the cemetery marker, is of course of Ezra Patterson. Now, if I may digress, I do that an awful lot, but I hope you don't mind. Ezra Patterson's headstone is in the Pittsford cemetery, not the Pioneer where you would expect it to be. But Ezra and Sheila Patterson were buried in a small cemetery that was called the Baptist Cemetery, and it was located up near their house up there, and it was on an area of Calkins Road. But the town found out that there was gravel near that cemetery, so they got a hold of all the people who were buried there and asked if they could move those bodies and those headstones so that they could use the gravel. And so some of the people were relocated to different places. Ezra really should be in the Pioneer Cemetery, but he's down in the Pittsford Cemetery. And his stone does look like this, and the Cemetery Association always puts a flag on his grave. And he also has that marker that says it was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. Now, that's my digression, I'm sorry. Anyway, heavy fines were established. Oh, I wanted to show you this house. This house is still here in Pittsford. Do you have any idea? Up at the top of Mendon Center Road Hill. And it was built by Noah Norton, and it is still there. You can hardly see it because of all the trees that have grown around it. But there's a wonderful barn behind it too. And so when you go up to the top of Mendon Center Road Hill, take a look to the right and peek around the trees and see if you can see it, because it was Noah Norton's house. And he was a supervisor as well. Let's see. Here's another picture of Major Ezra's house. He and Sheila lived in that. And as I said, there were 44 members who met in this little bitty house. And they established rules, and I shall read them to you. It's quote and unquote. Any person that shall blot or crease or soil any book in any shape or turn down any page shall forfeit 6 cents. And the tearing of every leaf shall be left to the discretion of the directors. And every leaf that shall be torn out shall forfeit double the price of the book. They had to be pretty careful. And as I said, there were 44 signed members of that first library company. And that company lasted until 1809, and I have no idea, none of our historic records tell what happened and where those people went. They were still very much involved in the community, I'm sure, until I know that Noah Norton had died, and I know that Elihu Dowd had died, and so some of those people were no longer around. But these other libraries were formed, like the Pittsford Social Library. I don't know much about it, but it was formed. And School District number 6 was the Cobblestone School over on Church Street in the village that used to be the Masonic Temple. Is now owned by a private owner. And at least 120 people were listed in as borrowing that. And then a woman named Mrs. Krill, and I don't know anything about Mrs. Krill, but she had a library of 80 books. Now, whether there were some of the original ones, probably, I don't really know. They weren't all as well documented as that first library. So then, let's see, number 1 South Main Street. What do you think that is? That's that. And that was when the Una Hutchison, this was in 1920. Una Hutchison, as I told you, I'm 150 years old, so I remember who Una Hutchison was. And Margaret Malone, they were intrigued. Margaret Malone was an aunt of Paul Spiegel. They were intrigued with the idea of a lending library. And so they found a way to get some books. They formed a connection with the Library Extension Division of New York State. And they were able to borrow 50 books. And the 50 books and some of the books that had been left over, they had 2 shelves up at the 2nd floor of Mr. Thomas's grocery store. This was where Mr. Thomas had a grocery store. Not in this picture, but that's where it was. And it was at number 1 North Main Street. No, number 1 South Main Street. And I made that mistake because they next went to the Crump store because they outgrew Mr. Thomas's space, and they took all their books over to the Crump store. And they had more space up there on the 2nd floor. And they were open, let's see, they were open for 2 hours. No, they were open longer than that. The South Main Street one was open. But this one was open for about 3 days, from 2 to 4, 3 days a week. So people could go up there and borrow a book. I think this is pretty amazing. I don't know whether you do too, but I just think it's incredible. That folks in early, oh, what did I do? Lori, what did I do?
Do you want to go to the next one?
Yes, we'll go to the next one. Okay. What did I do? I must have hit something.
Yeah, it's good. I'll keep an eye.
I was born before technology. I don't understand it. So anyway, you have to bear with me.
This is the little house.
That's right.
Inside of the street there.
That's the little house. But it was on the other side of the street. Do any of you remember? Mary Jane's nodding her head. It was on the other side of the street, and it had started its life Pretty much in that same space, but it had started its life as a doctor's office. And the doctor, excuse me, the doctor lived in the big house next to it on Monroe Avenue. But he had his office hours in this little house. Wasn't that nice? He didn't disturb his family. He had his office in this little house. But then the little house changed, and at one time it was a private dwelling. And a family named Matthews lived in it, and they had 2 little boys. I can't imagine living in this little bitty house with 2 little boys. But there they were. And then it became, it became the library. Then it became a travel agency. And there it sat, and it's such a dear little house. And then Jim Burdett, who owned the Burdett Food Market, was back behind this. If you stop and think about where this was on Monroe Avenue, Burdett's store was up behind it and faced South Main Street. And Jim wanted to have a driveway from his back parking lot out to Monroe Avenue so people could get into his store more easily than turning the corner onto South Main and turning into his driveway. So he was going to take this little house and not move it. He was going to tear it down. And it was such an important little house. So a group of citizens decided they should do something about it. And a group called the Pittsford Historical Society thought that something should be done.
What year are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have it on here, and I should have. I may find it. If I do, I'll let you know, okay?
63 or 4.
I'm sorry?
63 or 4.
What do you think?
I think it was 1964, 65, right?
64, 65?
Yeah.
Do we agree, those of you who know? Yeah, okay. All of those who are in the know agree. Okay, so the little house sat there until the Pittsford Historic Society decided it should not be torn down, but it should be moved and have a different use. So the little house needed to have a place to go, and the Historic Society needed to find a place for it. And they were very fortunate in being able to speak to the people who owned the house right across the street, and they made space available, and the little house was moved. Now, back in the early times, it would be easy to move a house, you know, you just put it on. Not when you're moving it across a major highway and you've got all these wires and all these stoplights and street lights and all sorts of things. So it was a major thing to move that little house across the street. But that little house sits there now across the street at number, 19 Monroe Avenue?
18.
I'm sorry?
18.
18, 19. 19 was where it was. This is 18, you're right. So that was the story about the little house. And now I want to move back to things about the library. Now in 1929, Pittsford had grown in size and reputation, and so had the Pittsford Community Library. And Una Hutchison was still very much involved, and she was elected president of the Pittsford Community Library. And Edna Steve Jones and Elizabeth Bacon served as vice presidents. And Hazel Allen, who was the wife of Dr. Lloyd Allen, who was our village town doctor forever and ever and ever. And I at 150 had him for a lot of things. Wait a minute, let me see where I was, excuse me. Robert Wadhams was the treasurer, and the collection of books, now this is fun to think about, they grew from 50 books, and now there are 5,739 books owned by the Pittsford Community Library. And the year before, it had only had 3,900 books. So it just kept growing. And then the following year, in 1934, there were 65,000 books. Now I'm going to jump a little bit here again. I hope you're still with me and you're understanding all the things I'm saying. The Charles Hastings Wiltsey family had owned a very large home, beautiful home, at 21 North Main Street. And they lived in it until the Wiltsey family moved to Rochester. And Mr. Wiltsey was employed in Rochester, and he also served as a volunteer in the Rundle Memorial Library. The Rundle was a very well-established and very, very heavily endowed and a well-respected association. And Mr. Wiltsey loved working there. And at his death, his daughter, who had inherited, oh, there's Mr. Wiltsey. Isn't he nice? And there's the home at number 21 North Main Street. And his daughter, Mary Emily Wiltsey Field, gave this house to the village of Pittsford. But it was to be used as a library, not as a private home. And the building was finished. The gathering room, the big meeting room, was finished to look like the Wiltsey's living room at 123 Plymouth Avenue in Rochester. And the rest of the house, the warm and wonderful, that's the room where the big folks sat and read and studied and looked at the papers and all sorts of things. And up there at the front, at the very front, that's the checkout desk, where everybody had to check out their desk. But aren't those lovely chairs and so forth? And look at all those books. But this was my favorite room. That was the children's room. And it had a fireplace. I never saw a fire in it, but it did have a fireplace. And those wonderful maple reading tables and chairs. And Joanne remembers them too, don't you, Joe? Yes. You could sit there and look at books and pictures and sit there all day long until somebody threw you out. But it was a lovely place. And just as a quick, brief aside, that little armchair next to the table that has something on it, I have in my historian office, so I still have a part of this. So, it was hard to, and the basement was finished too. The basement had an entrance down there. People seldom used it, but it was there. And there was a fireplace, and I have seen a fire in that fireplace because Girl Scouts used to meet down there too, and dance classes, and now of course it's used by the Legion. And there's a kitchen, and it's a wonderful building, and it was a wonderful area to be a library as well as a community house and a place for people to have meetings. Then, well, this library, that one that I just showed you, that one opened in 1938, and it was open 4 days a week. That was great.
I lost you. Where were you before 38? In the little house?
Yeah, before, no,
Well, see, yeah, well, there was some rain.
it was, we were in this house, the Wiltsey house, in 1924.
Okay.
And then they did all this renovating and so forth. I'm wrong. That's not right.
Well, at one time you said Wiltsey Crump above
Yeah.
there. And then we went to the little house. Was the little,
No, the little,
actually a library too, because it looked
Yes.
smaller than Wiltsey Crump.
yes, it was after Wiltsey Crump, yes. And then they came to this one in 1938. Sorry. I mixed up my dates here. In 1969, the Pittsford Village Board granted permission to the Pittsford Community Library to join the Monroe County Library System. And these benefits from the Monroe County Library System included being able to borrow books from almost any library in that county system. That was wonderful. You know, somebody over in Fairport could borrow a book and return it to Pittsford as far as that goes. That was great. Really like that. And then I want to just go back in time. So move your head from 38 back to 1923. And this was the Janes Library branch, and I'll tell you how this happened. This house was built over on, well, I call it East Rochester. It really is Pittsford town, but it's pretty close to East Rochester. And it was what we called the Janes building, but before that, it had been built by George and Ida Woodward, and they called it Harwood Farms. And they lived there until 1929, and he was, George was the founder and president of the Likely store in Rochester. Now, Likely sold luggage and so forth. That was a wonderful store. It was fairly near Sibley's department store. So George owned that store. And then when he died, the home was sold to State Senator Rodney Janes. And he lived there for 44 years with his family. And then Senator Janes willed that property to the town of Pittsford, and they took title to it, Pittsford took title to it in 1977, as well as a collection of 6,000 books. I don't know where Senator James got all those, but that was quite an addition. The Janes branch, and it had beautiful grounds. Does anybody remember this? And you remember the house and everything? It was lovely. The grounds were beautiful. Mostly, it was the first floor that was used. The second floor was pretty much for storage, and I guess there were some meetings up there too. But the Janes branch served the northern end of the town, and it stayed until it was absorbed by the Pittsford Library in 2005. So, let's go back to 1972. Some major changes took place. The town was growing very rapidly, and the town hall needed to be renovated. Now, heretofore, at the town hall, the south side of the town hall was the town's. The north side was the village. And so the town supervisor and the town clerk were over here, and the village clerk and the village mayor were over on the north side. And never the twain shall meet. There was a big hallway that went down between the two. But each one of those communities was growing very large, and so the town needed more space, more services, more staff, more everything. And so they needed to renovate. And about that time, someone declared that let's see what I have here. No, I don't want that yet. Sorry, you got to go back to Jane's. The building down on where the library was needed a lot of work. So they decided that they needed to move that library down to 24 State Street. Well, do you know what that was?
Star Market.
That was Star Market. Yeah. And so the village hall got changed, or the village library on South Main Street, North Main Street, got changed, excuse me, to be the village hall, and the library came to Star Market. So that poor library just kept moving. And then it says it doesn't look like a supermarket anymore. It was a nice library and a lot more space. And then this, you can read it as you will. I don't have to read it to you. I think the funny thing was that the staff room at the rear was the former lettuce washing room. And that it said, the lettuce room, only for happy heads. I must admit, I do not remember that. But the library was 11,000 square feet of space with an additional 5,000 in the basement. And the basement was at one time used as the court. You remember? Anybody have to go to court down in the basement of the Star Market? Well, it wasn't the Star Market. It was the Pittsford Library. And then, of course, as the town kept growing. And in October of 2003, now we're up to 2003, from 1803, the town approved a library board referendum, and a new two-story library was to be constructed at that State Street site. So that library was going to have to be moved. And all of the books in that library were moved to 3750 Monroe Avenue, which was where Graflex was. And then it became the senior citizens after the library left it. So you're all nodding, you all remember that. So while this was being rebuilt into the beautiful building in which we sit now, all those books were down at 3750 Monroe Avenue. Did any of you go down there to the library? Yeah? And you worked there?
I worked there. I lived there at 3650 for 42 years. That was 3 years ago. But we didn't have a lot of room.
Didn't have, no.
More like a warehouse.
Right. Right. Well, the new Pittsford Community Library. Oh, look at the dates. Now you can see how everything grew. And do you see the last date? 2021. And there are 204,000 books in this library. And there it is, this big, beautiful library. And as I said, that last count was given to us by the library director, Amanda Manigan. And she says there are 204,000 items in this collection. And so there we came from that little house out there on Mendon Center Road. And unfortunately, that little house didn't get saved. It was kind of before it was the thing to do to save old buildings. And so I have to share this one with you. That little house was still there. My aunt and uncle lived next door. Their names were Toby. And that little house was still there. And there was a woman who was an ex-slave who lived in it. And then she went back to the South. And that house sat there empty forever and ever until Pittsford finally decided that they needed the space for the Mendon Center Elementary School, and it was torn down, which is too bad. But there is a historic marker right there that says that's where that first library was, and that little house was there. And we know where this one is, thank heaven. So, there you are, library from 1803 up to 2021. Thanks.
Do you have any questions for Audrey?
Yes, I heard somebody say so. Yes.
Audrey, part of your presentation talked about Mr. Wilsey and his business. Do you have any personal information about he or his family? My impression is that he must have been very successful.
We have a picture, that's about it. A picture of him and his family and so forth, but that's, I'll look a little more in all of my library files and see if I come up with anything more about Mr. Wilson. He must have been a wonderful man, wonderful man. It was, the Likely store was just great for those of us who remember it. And then to have the Janes family turn over the house to the community of Pittsford was pretty wonderful.
Is that still there?
The house, yes.
And where is that?
200, well, it depends upon what you call it.
Right, the expressway there?
East Avenue was what I call it, but Fairport Road, yeah. And it is a beautiful home. It's a single-family home now, right? Yeah. Yes, Susan.
How much was that James Library used?
It was used a lot by the people who lived at the north end of town. I remember it mostly as a children's place. The children really had a beautiful room, and on the first floor, the grounds were gorgeous. They had lots of tulips and flowers and so forth. Lovely. And then you want to add to it?
It was really just for fiction books. It wasn't a research library.
No, that's right. Well, there were research.
No, they might have encyclopedias, things like that, but it wasn't.
No, not really. But on the second floor, because I helped move things from there, there were a lot of big research type books. And you're right, encyclopedias and so forth. And they were up on the second floor. Yeah.
I just had a question about the original library. Did they house books there, or
Yeah, Mr.
how did they share books? I guess?
Mr. Patterson must have had enough, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson must have had enough space to be able to store some of those 50 books. But obviously, the people in the community and some of those folks who came to establish the library probably took some of them and borrowed them for their edification as well. So I know that some of them were stored in the library. And this goes to another story, but little Ann Agate, who went to District Number 1 school, her family lived way over on Thornell Road. And so during the school week, she would live with the Pattersons because it was easier to walk up Mendon Center Road to District Number 1. And she had a lot of fun, I understand, looking at those books. They were probably way above her head, but she could at least look at them and get used to big books. So, yeah.
Just as a reference point, I believe that when they originally gave the property to be used as a James Library. The provision in it had to be only used as a library. But it also became a storage place because the problem that was happening here with the Star Market was there was no room to put out all of the books.
Right.
In the basement of the Star Market was a meat locker. We stored books in the meat locker, and they were cataloged well enough that you could retrieve them. In the same way, I think they used some of the storage at the James Library. But that was one of the other reasons to build a new library.
To get all the, well, yeah, and Mr. Rodney James gave 6,000 books. Now, obviously, they had to have room for all of that collection as well.
But I used to store the volunteer activity, and before you moved, you had to store multiple books on the side, etc., and even on the shelves. So there was physically no room, no meeting rooms to speak of, which was the addition of these two of Walt Ruger's originally now.
Yeah, look at how this place, books have to be stored, some of them on the sides. Excuse me, I talk too much.
Any other questions? Thank you so much, Audrey. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.